Hello and welcome to video 3. Let's get right to our learning objectives. Today we're going to discuss several concepts that are closely related to globalization. And many of these are concepts that you've probably heard before. So what we want to do is distinguish the meaning of these concepts from globalization and discuss their importance in relationship to the concept of globalization. So we'll be looking at imperialism, colonialism, development, westernization, easternization, Americanization. And in doing so, we want to be aware of similarities and differences, and indeed there are debates about each one of these concepts being a substitute or a proxy for globalization. So we want to definitely understand what the difference is between globalization and, for example, imperialism. So let's talk about imperialism. The history of imperialism involves methods employed by one nation state to gain power over other areas and then to exercise control over them. And it originated with the Roman Imperium. That's where the word comes from, imperialism. And it was first associated with domination and political control over one or more neighboring nations. And it came to imply rule over large geographic areas. It started being questioned at the end of the 19th century when powerful countries in Europe and the United States were competing for control over previously undeveloped areas, especially in Africa. People questioned the rationale that superior cultures should control what are seen as inferior cultures, which was the idea of imperialism. The underlying ideology was that the empire contained in the country of the empire was, and the culture was especially superior to the countries that were being colonized or in which they were experiencing imperialism. There are several types of imperialism. There is cultural imperialism, in which cultures impose themselves more or less consciously on other cultures. There was media imperialism. For example, especially Western media and their technologies dominating less developed nations and cultures. There is a new kind of imperialism concept developed by David Harvey, describing a 21st century imperialism developed in the US that involves an unpredictable mixture of political and economic imperialism. In fact, Ghost argues that this capitalist imperialism is not limited to the United States and that international institutions and multilateral agreements are influenced by large corporations in more powerful countries. And these corporations control areas that were once controlled by local and national government. So it's important to point out that although the term imperialism started taking on a negative connotation, in the beginning of the 20th century, many scholars argue that imperialism persists today in its different forms, be it cultural, media, capitalist imperialism. So this question, is globalization imperialism? It's a good question, and I would say, and Ritzer and Dean say no, but imperialism was very important to the development of globalization as it started, nations moving around the world, moving goods, services, and people around the world, even though they were essentially taking over other areas of the world. It was an underlying process that was very important for the modern development of globalization. Now let's talk about colonialism. Colonialism is a closely related concept to imperialism, but it is much more political in nature because it involves the creation by the colonial power of an administration in the area that has been colonized to run its internal affairs. So basically, one nation state is taking over another area. The first era is the 15th century by Spain and Portugal, and established colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. So early on, Spain and Portugal, but then later joined by Great Britain, France, Germany, Japan, and even the United States. But by the end of World War I, most of the formal colonialism was over as countries decided, this isn't the right thing to do, to be basically taking over other nations. Colonialism is a concept that differs from imperialism in that it requires political control of colonies, whereas imperialism involves economic control of geographic areas that are not necessarily formal colonies. So is globalization colonialism? No, but it's an important underlying process, just as imperialism was. And many are talking now that we are in this new era of post-colonialism. And this refers to development that takes place in a former colony after the colonizing power departs. So we still have the legacy of colonialism and imperialism. However, without the formal colonization and nation-state autonomy, we have to look at it a little bit differently in that this is the legacy effects that you would be seeing right now in sort of a post-colonial situation. So when we're talking about globalization, imperialism and colonialism are important historical developments of political, economic, and cultural globalization, but they are dated. They are, 100 years out of date, I'd say. So they're also systems based on nations. But it is complicated here because, as I've said, there are still plenty of studies that talk about, like David Harvey, talk about the new imperialism, looking at the economic domination, particularly by large corporations, through international institutions of countries in the global south. Although not formally colonies, they still tend to be heavily influenced by this economic activity of corporations that are located in the global north. Another concept is called development. And you may have heard of development projects that go on, especially in the global south, that are maybe funded by institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. So development is a historical stage from roughly the 1940s to 1970s, and you can think of it as a project primarily concerned with the economic development of specific nation states not regarded as sufficiently developed. It was a project of the global north that was elitist and ethnocentric in that it intended to help nations in the global south be more like nations in the global north. It assumed the global south to be inferior to the global north. And in response to the ideas put forth by development theorists, dependency theory arose, which is a theory that basically looks at, it's a critical theory, it's critical of development, and it says that the development of nation states of the South contributed to a decline in their independence and to an increase in their dependence on the global North. So although formal colonization was no longer happening, you could say that these development projects, which were very much involved a lot of loans to countries in the global south, and it's a complex process, but what basically happened is when the global south gets that much money from corporations and institutions in the global north, it really depends on being able to develop their economy to pay the loans back, and in many cases that just did not happen, and in fact the profits that were made from whatever it was they were developing, coffee for example, fruit, raw materials, textiles, whatever it would be, oil, the flow of money of profit from those economic activities were too often going back to the businesses and institutions in the global north. And a cycle of dependency developed, especially with regards to loans, because countries in the global south that couldn't pay their loans would ask for additional loans or would be given additional loans with even more strings attached from the global north. So a cycle of dependence basically develops, and Andre Gunder Frank, who basically created this theory, said that this was no coincidence. This was a deliberate strategy by powerful entities in the global north to keep the global south dependent, as there was no formal political or economic rule after colonialism ended. World systems theory is another theory, and this basically talks about how countries got to be, where they are in terms of their level of development, global north, global south. And world systems theory sees it mainly divided between the core and the periphery, with the latter dependent on and exploited by the core nation states. So core countries tend to be former colonial empires, and peripheral nation states tend to be former colonies, or at least kind of areas of the world that were subject to imperialism. So from world systems theory, we can take that when we look at much of the global north and global south, it carries forward the inertia that was separating the affluent countries from the poorer countries during the era of colonialism. And this is a picture of my old professor at SUNY Binghamton. He was the author of The Modern World System, volumes 1, 2, and 3. His name was Emanuel Wallerstein. He died several years ago, but he was a very tough teacher. He used the Socratic method, where we were asked questions until we basically got them wrong. And we also read more than a book a week. And every several weeks, he would have us write a 2-page paper summarizing the arguments in several of the books. So I learned to write very concisely in his class. He was obviously a very brilliant professor and theorist. Westernization, here's another term that's closely related to globalization. Westernization is basically the spread of markets and democracy to other countries, and it is Europeanization plus Americanization. So I think Westernization talks about the old East and West divide. I guess if we were making up this term now, it would be called Northernization, but we don't have that term. So an example of Westernization is the fact that English has been adopted and taught in schools of many countries around the world. There are markets that are involved with Westernization that vary both between and within Western countries, but certainly markets and the spread of markets is very important. And the spread of democracy is also very important, although we do have to see that many countries, particularly in the East, that have democracies would be seen as different. So Pakistan and Egypt, they talk about having military dictatorships and instability. So you can have voting and so forth, but I think Westernization was looking at a more liberal democracy than you would find perhaps in the East. Also, people are not talking about Westernization as being the only kind of force now. So we also have Easternization, which we'll talk about in a second. So while Westernization has real impacts, definitely globalization is not Westernization. So now let's talk about Easternization. Is globalization Easternization? And really, this should be an easy question, right? Because globalization refers to a planetary spread. But nevertheless, Easternization, I think, is an underlying process, and more so than it used to be. There are definitely cultural and economic influences of the East on the West. So, but with Easternization, I think scholars would say it's based more on the spread of culture than it is on any kind of economic activity. So we have yoga shops all over town, right? Places where you can go buy yoga. I don't think they're called shops. I think that's a yogurt shop. I think it's a yoga studio. Um, and we also have origami, the paper folding, right? I'm sure you can think of lots of things. I think I read an article last year, or had my students talk about an article about boba tea from Thailand, I believe. So definitely, as the world has become more globalized, I think that we see not only westernization, but also influences of the East on the West. And of course, the rise of China has raised concerns about Easternization being imposed upon other areas. For example, areas of Africa, where China has established a lot of economic activity. And so now we're seeing the same concerns about westernization with cultural imperialism, economic imperialism, and so forth in a newer form. We're seeing that now from scholars talking about Easternization. But globalization is neither Easternization nor Westernization. Both are important in the historical development that leads to the era of globalization. And I would also say that with Easternization, it's just become a more important underlying process as time has gone by in the current time period. And again, I would say especially because of the economic power of China, but also things like social media, where we can see people doing things all over the world and things catch on and go viral. And I'm sure you can all think of Easternization evidence that you notice online or in the paper or in your own lives. So both Easternization and Westernization continue to exist, but as they are one of the many multi-directional flows that make up the overall process of globalization. So far in the lecture, we're seeing some terms like imperialism and colonialism that were sort of historically important for the development of globalization. We're also seeing terms like Easternization and Westernization that were also important in the development, but are underlying processes that continue to this day. Some folks would also say imperialism is definitely a process underlying globalization that continues to this day. Now let's talk about Americanization. So in general, this refers to imports by non-Americans of that which is closely associated with America or Americans. And de Grazia defines it as a spread of mass consumption practices, so focusing on consumption across the most diverse cultures. It's the fostering of common consumption practices and the spread of the service ethic, chain stores, big brand goods, corporate advertising. So when we think about Americanization, we think a lot about media, culture, and consumption. I always think about McDonald's being in so many countries in the world, nearly all of them, for example, and how that fast food model was adopted by so many countries around the world. I also think about the popularity of Hollywood and Hollywood movies. Think about the popularity of some of the sports, like the Chicago Bulls around the world. And a lot of these things involve, yes, like buying for the Bulls, right? You're buying jerseys and hats and T-shirts, and although they're not a very good basketball team now, Michael Jordan played a long time ago, right? But they are still very well known. Americanization is part of the larger component of globalization. Again, like Easternization and Westernization, I think it's just a very specific to the, and they're usually talking about the U.S., not North and South America, but and Central America, but specific to the U.S. But U.S.ization is tougher to say, right? United Statesization just doesn't have the same ring. So, Americanization is a useful concept, especially in the decades following World War II, and when applied specifically to cases of American influence within politics, economics, or culture. And so, when we're talking about this kind of Americanization, this is definitely, I think I've mentioned this, after World War II, the United States was fortunate enough not to have its mainland destroyed by the war, as many countries were in Europe and Japan. So the United States had a lot of economic power, selling goods around the world, had a lot of political had a lot of political power to be able to make loans to other countries and in return for favors or for favorable agreements. The book does point out that you can have Americanization without America, and this just means that America, in many places where American culture has been adopted, the United States really has very little involvement with them politically. But again, if we're thinking about consumption and media, this should not be surprising, right? Also, a nation state can be Americanized without necessarily being affected by America per se. There was a question in there about if the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, was that the end of Americanization, basically? And your book argues that the Great Recession, no, did not make Americanization an outdated concept. Actually, scholars had been looking at a long-term United States economic decline that began in the early 1970s when the post-World War II boom that I just talked about there at the top of the page, top of the PowerPoint, when that boom basically ended, and you could see on all sorts of economic indicators, employment, GNI, so forth, the Vietnam War sort of tearing apart the country culturally, and United States just was not the powerhouse that it had been. And that's beginning in the 1970s. So the Great Recession was basically the latest economic crisis within this decline that showed that, yes, America was no longer the strongest. So it's less resonant than it once was, but I still think, and Ritzer and Dean agree, that yes, Americanization is resonant. The United States remains a political, economic, and military superpower, and it has much influence, but perhaps not as much in relationship to other countries as it had during the decades following World War II. And I think, when we're looking at the current administration, the election of Donald Trump, I think, and the whole Make America Great ideology, they rarely say when it is they were talking about when they say Make America Great Again, when President Trump says Make America Great Again. But I do think that probably he's referring, a large part of what he's imagining when he says Make America Great Again is this post-World War II boom era of Americanization. But we have to remember that prior to World War II, America was in trouble with the Great Depression in the 1930s. Roosevelt made a lot of policy changes with the New Deal to try and revive the economy. But it was really World War II that turned things around, ramped up mass production in factories in the United States. But it was lucky because, as I said, the United States was pretty far away from where all the battles were occurring, and so they weren't destroyed. soldiers came home, United States economy ramped right up and kind of dominated the world for the next, 15 to 20 years. Let's talk about anti-Americanism. Anti-Americanism can be thought of a resentment, a psychological and or religious hostility stemming from and perpetuated by long-lasting stereotypes and images of America. We have historical anti-Americanism, which is the resentment toward the U.S. based on its past behavior, whereas in this kind of anti-Americanism, the United States has looked at sort of this imperial power that is highly involved in the global south with economic exploitation of nation states in the global south, through international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. Also, our military policies with involvement in the Middle East have been cause for anti-Americanism from folks who live there. Also, this anti-Americanism is rooted in not only the historical but the current political and economic policies of the United States. And with the Trump administration re-election of Trump, I think we've seen probably an increase in anti-Americanism as he has basically imposed tariffs on even allies, long-term allies like Canada, and he has been very involved in the Middle East, calling the military in to drop bombs. He is basically reversing flows of people to the U.S. through immigration policy changes, resulting in massive numbers of detention and deportations. There are heavy tariffs on our trading partners, which decreased the amount and slowed the flow of goods that are traded, and it also soured relations with other nation states, including our allies. The Trump administration policy changes have decreased its contribution to the North American Treaty Organization, NATO, and during his first administration, he withdrew troops from Afghanistan, lowering the influence of the United States in that country. And so the Trump administration, as it's executed its America First strategy, some other countries have responded with anti-American rhetoric, as well as new efforts and strategies to strengthen their nation states and their allegiances in ways that make them less dependent on and connected with the United States. So we have external and internal influences that I think are decreasing Americanization, whether it's because people in other countries don't like us, for lack of better words, or whether it's because our own presidential administration is, like the saying says, trying to give primacy to American interests, and sometimes at the expense of our prior commitments to other countries and international institutions. So I do think that we are seeing an era of de-Americanization. Now, does that mean there's no more globalization? No, I think it just means that the United States and Americanization as a central underlying process is losing some of the importance it once had. The United States is still very much a major player, but we see kind of a reversal of the flows, literally of some of the flows of goods and people, as well as a nationalist protectionist economic strategy. So now we have to ask ourselves if we've entered a new historical era of the post. And scholars argue that many of the historical processes that structured the 20th century and which define modernity no longer apply. So for example, nation states are subject to many international rules. Many countries in Europe are now part of the European Union. Countries like China that were not very powerful during the modern era are now very powerful economically, politically, militarily. And so all of this has made the current time period less stable. It changes quickly and boundaries are less defined. And some scholars have argued that we have entered this era of postmodernity. So it is likely the dawn of a new era, but we do not yet know what it is or what to call it. And so, in this regard, globalization is sufficiently broad and encompassing that it can help us understand the way in which political, economic, and cultural change has shaped the social world. So, globalization, yes, is a useful concept. So, the next chapter, chapter 4 on neoliberalism, describes one useful attempt to understand what kind of global political economy has emerged, and it's called neoliberalism. We'll be talking about that more on the next video. Okay, so there are several closely related concepts to globalization. Some are very important parts of globalization now and have always been. Others were more important for the development of globalization. But now you know the difference. I think the main thing is that globalization is more of a broad umbrella term and contains under it many closely related but not identical processes. And that's all for today. We will see you in the next video.